Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this new edition of the Exponential Blueprint. Today, we are going to talk about board excellence, and I'm privileged to have with me Patrick Dunne. Patrick Dunne is a board chair and a board expert. And Patrick, how are you today?
Yeah, very good, very good.
Okay. Now, Patrick, I had the privilege to meet Patrick more than 10 years ago while I was doing my Financial Times Board Director program. A few words about the Exponential Blueprint. I am the founder of the newsletter. I'm a CFO expert as well as a board director, board director by profession as well. I've been chairman of a number of boards. I've been an executive director and a financial executive. And currently, my main activity is mergers and acquisition. Now, the Exponential Blueprint is trusted by more than 22,000 founders, investor, and chief executive. And with this video, I wanted to really thank everyone who is actually contributing to the newsletter. All your comments are really, really welcome. And in the link below, you're going to be able to subscribe to the newsletter to join all these people. And you're very welcome to this journey. So let's come to today. First of all, let me leave the floor to Patrick. So Patrick can actually explain about his current activity, his history, how much experience he's gained with board and with so many other activities, and also philanthropic activities and the books as well. Go ahead, Patrick.
Great. Well, I'll try and be brief on that. So, I'm a mathematician by background. Started life in the chemicals industry in operations research, sort of mathematical modeling type jobs. Then moved into private equity with a very international private equity firm, 3i Group PLC, which was interesting because apart from being involved in venture, growth capital, buyouts, and that private equity world, it was also a public company. So one of the UK's top 100 companies in the FTSE 100. I spent the bulk of my career there, ending up on the operating committee of 3i. But during that time, I had a sort of awakening moment fairly early on in my career, actually, where I was in charge of a workout portfolio and went to a really appalling board meeting. And that really got me thinking about, well, what makes a good board and what makes a good board director? And also thinking about our own business. How do we train people to be on boards and how do we pick the right people and how do we develop them as well? And that led to the creation of an activity within the business and various other things, including being asked to take part in what was then a seminal governance review for the UK, the Higgs review, which came up with the senior independent director and led to the creation of the 30% Club. 3i was a great place to work, apart from the immense sort of learning. You also had, if they wanted to keep you, freedom to serve on other boards, as long as obviously they didn't conflict with the business in any way. So I had the great opportunity to serve on a number of boards while I was at 3i. And so when I retired, um, I already had a small portfolio. Today, I have a number of activities. So I chair the Royal Voluntary Service in the UK. I have a business called Board Delta, which does board advisory and training work, including the partnership I have with the Financial Times, which Matteo mentioned. Um, I also have founded a number of social sector organizations, including ESSA in Africa, which I chair today, which is working on big systemic issues in African education. So I spent a lot of time in Africa. I'm also a visiting professor at Cranfield University. I've written a number of books. Boards is probably the least imaginative title, but that's probably the one that people will know of me for. And more recently, I co-authored with Rebecca Robbins a book about five generations at work, largely because I was getting fed up with the discourse that was taking place around intergenerational working, which to me seemed very reductive and divisive. When I thought, isn't it fantastic that we've got all these different generations in the workforce, and why can't we make that into an opportunity rather than grumble about micro differences in perspective and so on. So the book is a lot about what companies around the world are doing to maximize the opportunity that affords. I live in London. Probably 70% of what I do is outside the UK, though, including Africa, as I've already mentioned. And I have three fantastic boys. And any day now, I'll have my second granddaughter to be with and support. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you, Patrick. It was such a great introduction from you. The range of activity you described really, effectively explain how precious your advice can be to so many, and this is how, and obviously how precious this podcast would be to so many people who are looking also to become better board directors as well. Let me come to the, you know, to the agenda today. So we're gonna cover. It's going to be divided into seven parts. The first one is going to be some introductory background about how to be a board director. The second one is we're going to dive straight into how we can we can see how a board can become effective effectively. So we can see how to be a very strong performing board director. Then we're going to look at director duties and liabilities, the structure and remuneration, the audit, financial reporting and oversight. Then we're going to look into risk management, internal controls, and then culture, chairmanship, and dynamics in general. So let me start with an introduction about really what happens during the board life. Now, the question is, you've chaired multiple boards across so many sectors. Um, Now, when it comes to governance, yeah, what was the magic moment that led you to say, well, this is really what I need to do? This is my was going to be my activity to improve how, for example, governance is executed in businesses in general. And after that magic moment, what was the evolution overall over the years?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, I was probably over promoted early on, and so I felt very ignorant, and I felt quite vulnerable. That did I really have what it took to this job? And then the first board meeting I went to as part of this job, I'd been to other board meetings before, was a family company where we had, I think it was a 15% stake, so a small minority stake. We didn't have a board seat, we just had an observer rights. And the company was in difficulty. And what struck me in this board meeting was they had no clarity of purpose. I couldn't understand why this family owned this company anymore. It didn't have a good succession opportunity. The strategy was all over the place, so there was no clarity of purpose of the business as well as why they should own it. They were completely misaligned on pretty well everything. They just were arguing the whole time. Uh, and so I thought, well, even if they had clarity of purpose, um, it'd be very difficult to keep that alignment because there's no alignment. They really don't like each other. They really don't respect each other. It would be difficult. And then I thought they don't have the right people. So their level of self-awareness was really low. They they didn't have what I thought it would take to get out of the situation that we're in. So you had a purpose issue, you had a people issue, and then with regards to the board processes, pretty well every aspect was challenged. So I wasn't sure they had the right agenda. Papers were really poor and not very informative. The management of the meeting by the chair wasn't great. Um, and it was very hard when you looked at board minutes to see whether they actually followed anything up. So I drew a triangle during the meeting, and it was purpose, people, process. And I thought I had a portfolio of 65 investments to look after. I thought actually, you know, if we really want to make more money, recover value from this portfolio, and we want to reduce the hassle that we have, because underperforming companies for an investor are generally quite a lot of hassle, then actually, if we get the board sorted out, we might be able to maximize the potential value creation and minimize the potential hassle. So that was my sort of moment, if you like. And then I went back and I discussed with my boss, when we make an investment, what do we say to the board about what we think they should be doing? What's our role where we're actually on the board? How do we contribute to that? And when we pick people to be our nominee directors or representatives, what's the criteria and how do we select them? And so I was just generally sort of ignorant and inquisitive. Um, and I think that's a very good sense, not unconfident, but I think humility is really important for non-executives generally. And I think in that moment, I think that feeling and that sense of humility actually was a fantastic thing to have because it led me to ask questions which perhaps other people thought, well, that's pretty obvious, although it wasn't. That they would feel embarrassed if they asked. I wasn't embarrassed at all to ask those questions, and it led to great things. So in terms of how my philosophy evolved, I'll be brief because I'm sure we'll come back to these bits, but that basically led me to think you have to be always learning. The art and the science of being a board member develops, moves on. And you just look at the last 5 years, how many things have changed in the way that boards operate, in the way that the context has changed, and so on. So I always had this philosophy of, I'll never know everything I need to know, and I still don't. I've been a chair for 20 odd years, and I still, constantly learning all the time. And I think you have to have that there. The second thing is to understand that there are really good general principles which seem to hold true for lots of different situations and lots of different times and with lots of different people. But the context always provides uh, an important um, backdrop and driver of how you do things. So you may have a general principle, but how you're actually going to bring about the thing that you want to see brought about will depend very much on the context. And most important in that context are the characters that are on the board now or that you're going to get on the board. The people dynamics are really critical. So yeah, I suppose that in summary is kind of what first drew me to governance and also how my philosophy has changed and how that's changed with different experiences, different cultures, different types of organization, different situations.
Oh, thank you so much, Patrick. And what I really appreciate here is the framework of structure and the simplicity. Even though each situation is unique, we will always have to go through endless iteration. But you mentioned about the three people, processes, and purposes. Basically, it's just where just to remind myself what Steve Jobs says. Like, if you can turn complexity into simplicity, you can move mountains. And I suppose in an ever-changing world, like, in so many different situations with so many different boards, so many different companies, yeah, trying to apply a simple structure can only be helpful. So, that leads me nicely to the next question. I wanted to ask you this. Can you share a pivotal moment? Again, something that really you just remember in your career where there was a major change in the organization because of a bold decision. Whether it's something that created a positive change or whether there's something that created a negative change.
Yeah, well, there have been so many of both
Tell us just
over
one.
the years. I think I would zone in on the board's relationship with the executive, and in particular, the chair's relationship with the CEO. And the decision that every chair uh, has to be conscious of is, you know, have we got the right formulation of the leadership team? And have we got the right CEO for this phase of development? And uh, I've been incredibly lucky. I mean, ESSA being a case in point with appointing people into their first CEO role. So I know some chairs will feel that, actually it's always better to appoint someone who's got a lot of experience because, that plays safe. There's less potential reputational risk for the chair if you appoint, someone who's been proven. But I focus a lot on the circumstances of the organization and what I feel is needed for that next development phase. So in ESSA, uh, we're only 10 years old, but we've had two CEOs to this point, both of whom have done a fantastic job, both of whom were very different in terms of what they brought and in the end what they delivered. And the first one was fantastic for that startup phase. Um, the second one, really good for developing the organizational um, structure, capabilities, processes, all of that. They're a fantastic job. And so I think that's true. I think when you assume a chair role, um, the sequencing of when the chair retires and when the CEO retires is really quite important to get right. And so I remember in another organization, I won't name it, where um, a CEO was appointed. I didn't feel reasonably quickly they were the right person. Um, but you want to support them, give them the opportunity to prove that they are, but that wasn't really happening. And so you have to deal with that. And it's not easy for a lot of people, um, board members who wanted that person to be appointed in the first place, have supported them, and maybe feel it's sort of a failure on their part. Um, my overwhelming principle with these things is what is best for the organization, and the degree of social awkwardness that surrounds a change of leadership is a price well worth paying to have the right CEO. Now, you may make that choice wrong, you may make that judgment wrong, but I think as long as you genuinely believe you're doing what you think is best for the organization, and you have a fair process, and you have a rigorous process, and you have an inclusive process, then that's what you should be doing as a chair. That's an important part of your job. I think one of the things I think that in taking over the chair role at the Royal Voluntary Service just about year and a half ago, one of the things that the organisation had been through a period of challenge because of COVID. It lost a significant proportion of its income for several years because of COVID. Yet the demand for what it did rose dramatically. It was very stretched, and there was a kind of weariness, if I could put it that way. And I thought the organization was just brimming with potential, that it had a lot of opportunities and it has some great people. Um, and I thought the board could be more optimistic. It's very hard if you're battered down by losing, pretty much half your income for several years for you to be optimistic like that. So I would not criticize the former board at all. I think they were battle weary. And so I think in that case, it's really a board decision to be more positive, to be more optimistic, to actually take a little bit more risk in terms of investing in opportunities. And that's what we've been doing. And we're now in a reasonably good position, rebuilding our reserves. We're ahead of income pre-COVID now. And we've added to the team. We've invested in technology, which had been lacking, various things. Now, the proof of the pudding will be, you know, probably after I finish being chair as to whether those decisions were really good. But touch wood, so far, so good. We haven't got everything right, but I think there's lots of promise and there's lots of potential, and the organisation has a vim and a vigor about it that's quite encouraging.
Thank you so much, Patrick, and also telling us about the current situation, the current activities going on, and what I picked particularly as a very useful lesson for all of us. Well, two lessons. First of all, the separation between the CEO and the chairman, where we see the chairman managing the board and the CEO managing the business. That's a very, very important distinction. And that's where we tend to see founders really struggling to become a CEO, let alone having an independent board of directors. The other thing which is very important for many who are listening is how you deal with change. Now, we know that businesses go different type of phases. A startup is not like a scale up. A scale up is not like a stagnation. A stagnation is not like crisis. Crisis is not like exit. As we know, there are five phases, in which really behaviors change, and success is only possible if we are willing to pivot. And as you rightly mentioned, Patrick, it's also about wealth creation as well as wealth management. Because we got too many situations where education about wealth management is overwhelming, but you also have to be passionate about the wealth creation process. So thank you so much for your insightful view on this.
Yeah.
Let me know. Sorry, go ahead,
I
Patrick.
was going to say just one thing to add. One of the things I think is important about that relationship between the board and the executive and the chair and the CEO in particular is to think of it like a Venn diagram, or actually a series of Venn diagrams where you don't want to be in a parallel universe where there's no real connection. You don't want to be trying to do each other's jobs, so the circles are overlapping. Where you want to be is in the middle, where you have a really nice intersection between the two circles, and that will change, as you've pointed out, depending on the stage of development, the context, and so on. So I think it's flexible, but the most important thing is you talk about it. So you talk about these things with the CEO. Is this one that needs to go to the board or not? Do you need a bit of support on that for a short period from a board member? Those kinds of things. So it's a flexible Venn diagram, if you like. But that intersection's got to be constructive, and actually, the CEO and the chair are responsible for managing that intersection.
Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, your endless experience obviously is allows us really to look at so many different situations, so many different lessons from which we can all benefit. And yeah, I mean, the structure is really, really fundamental. And that's where evolution, a business needs to evolve. And
Mm.
it's a very important part of really being successful. You go through different phases, successes and failure. So talking about failure, talking about success, board effectiveness is really center stage when it comes to any discussion about any success or any failure. We can be as educated as we would like to be. We can be as experienced as we like to be, but eventually it's execution that makes a business success or fail effectively. Yeah. Um, Now, within board effectiveness, I would like to ask you this question, Patrick. What are, in your experience or in your opinion, either of those, the three most common reason why boards become ineffective?
Yeah. Well, I think the overarching thing is boards are ineffective when they make the wrong decisions. Uh, and we all make decisions which go wrong because circumstances change, we didn't have the information, whatever. But if you look at the three underlying reasons why we make wrong decisions, I think I go back to my little triangle that we don't have clarity of purpose about what we want the
Mhm.
company to become or to be. We don't have clarity around, the purpose of the board and the purpose of the exec, so there's a muddle there. So there's a purpose kind of reason, if you like. There's a people reason because we don't have the right people and they aren't working together in the right way. Or we might have the right people and they aren't working together in the right way. Those two things are equally important, I think, as we see in the world of sport. You can have what looks like a great team sheet, glittering stars, individuals, but they don't work as a team. So you have to have that combination. And it's more complex than that because they also have to work as effectively with the executive group. So that's important. Um, Also within that people bit, you can have the influence of stakeholders can be tremendously helpful or can be tremendously destructive. Uh, and so, the chair in particular needs to be conscious of, have we got the right stakeholder strategy and all the rest of it. So there's a set of people things. And then process, I think, if you haven't got a good process for making decisions, if it's ineffective and inefficient, um, if it's inefficient, it will become ineffective because people get grumpy when it's inefficient, you don't use your time to best effect. At the moment, in a world where we are bombarded with issues to deal with, um, we don't have control over many things which will influence our future, and that seems to be growing, that list of
Mhm.
things. Um, then you really need to use your time well. You really need to focus and you really need to be well informed. So I go back to those three common reasons: lack of purpose or clarity of purpose or alignment of purpose. You haven't got the right people working together in the right way, and actually you just don't have good process.
Thank you for reminding about this simplicity, the people, processes, and purposes, because again, simplicity always wins. And your description about the imperfect world is where so many will draw lessons. Yeah, because too many people think, oh well, I need to wait for perfect situation to take the right decision. Well, it doesn't happen like that. Never. You
Yeah,
always
there's
have
a
to.
yeah, and there's a very good example at the moment where many boards are wrestling with should we adopt dynamic budgeting instead of the classic ritualized approach. So that sounds like it's a process issue, but it's also a people issue. Do we have the right people, the right board, as well as the right executive to enable us to use dynamic budgeting effectively? And actually, what is the point of doing that? And the point of that may be that we are more resilient, but also we are better able to maximize opportunities. So rather than waiting till we find out, if we set things up so that we know what we will do if we have more cash, if we don't have as much cash, if we have those hires in, or if we don't have those hires in, if our competitors do this or they don't, then we'll be a bit ahead of the game. We'll be more agile.
Thank you, Patrick. And this is where uh, so many will draw a few more lessons about this. It's about the dynamic world in which we will live. Effectively, a business will start obviously with the risk. Someone will have to take a risk to start a business, but it will have to live with risks forever. So you always have to constantly calculate managing risk.
Hmm.
You always have to take trade-off decision. Yeah, that's there are countless issues, and obviously it's only human intelligence, by the way, that can deal with this. Because many will say,
Yeah,
okay, well, we need to get artificial intelligence to help. That's not going to really help us because those decisions are really driven by a snapshot that is never going to be perfect, effectively.
yeah.
um, so that leads me to another question to you. Now, in your experience, we always hear about high
Hmm.
performing board, and then we hear about just just that. a situation where there's no such a performance because we just can see like, people sometimes people they call it like, rubber stamp or ticking box. Now, what in your experience, what separate the one from the other one? What separates the good performance from the non-performance or the low performance, should we say? Yeah.
So I think Warren Bennis it was who said, vision is the ability, power is the ability to convert vision into reality. So for me, a high-performing board is one that's enabled to create a reality from the vision that it has. So, and if you look at those great businesses, great social organizations, great boards in the public sector, they've been able to take an idea, take a vision of something they want to see achieved and make it happen. And they do that through not just making the right decisions, through implementing those decisions in the most effective way. Many boards, are composed of fantastically bright people, and they may decide, this is the right thing to do, but can they create a culture in the organization, have the right leadership team, the right governance to enable that to happen? So when you look at the role of the board, I always think, assuming the vision is clear and agreed, then the role of the board is to ensure you've got the right strategy, the right resources, and the right governance. And that's what separates high performing boards from box ticking ones. Box ticking ones may be too focused on the governance box, um, and they're focused on satisfying, you know, a wide range of people who and they sort of are too led by that. The high performing boards, I think, do what they think is the right thing for the organization to achieve its vision. They have a really good stakeholder strategy that's integrated. They're not just being pulled around by the shareholders today, the customers tomorrow, the staff next week. It's properly balanced and integrated. Um, Ultimately, what separates high performing boards from the others is the quality of the leadership of the chair and of the CEO. Those two, if you get those two characters right, and they fit with what you're trying to achieve, then you're more likely to be successful. So I hope that's not too rambly, but I think it's about, making the right decisions, but converting them into reality, not just taking the decision.
Thank you, Patrick. In particular, one of the main characteristic of a board is how he acts as a hub in between the business, in between so many stakeholders. Stakeholders could be internal or external. So it's really so educational to hear about your description about what makes a board performing well, compared to just a situation where there's oversight and nothing else. Now, we
Yeah,
need absolutely both. We need absolutely both.
yeah.
Are you able to share a case study where there was a board turnaround, so a complete change of governance, and what was the reason why this had to happen and how it happened?
Yeah, it'll be anonymous, but it's
That's okay.
a case study. Um, it was an organization that was losing customers, didn't have the right people, was in the wrong premises, was running out of money fast, had lost its credibility with key stakeholders in its market. And the turnaround came, first of all, a new chair was appointed to sort it out, basically.
Mhm.
Um, the first thing they did was really think hard about whether the organization was savable. So, is this worth saving? Can it be saved? And think about what sort of executive leader it needed to bring about that turnaround. and at the same time think about what sort of board it needed to achieve that turnaround. At the same time, because it was running out of money, it needed the continuing support of its financial backers, so bank, equity holders. And so the chair was someone of great credibility, not me. It was a different person. And they were able to speak to the financial backers and say, look, I think it's salvageable for these reasons. I think this is going to take a bit of time. So that was wise not to promise too much. I think I need to appoint an interim CFO very quickly so we can understand what the real financial position is now and also what the financial dynamic is so we can understand how much we can invest from existing resources or not, what costs we have to save, and so on. One of the things he had spotted was he thought the pricing, which had been left the same for a long time, there wasn't an up-to-date pricing model. And he felt actually maybe through changing pricing, which is difficult when you're in difficulty, might actually be a solution. There hadn't been for some time a customer profitability analysis. So there were various things he thought, if this business had a really good CFO, these things would be in place. They're not in place. Financial control was weak as well. But the key thing was what is the what are the characteristics, criteria of the leader, the executive leader that we want? He was incredibly fortunate. He used a search firm, but very quickly they focused on people who were available very quickly. So there was a small pool, and they had a rigorous process. They didn't rush it. They picked a fantastic CEO, and she came in and brought. She had a lot of ideas about what you could do with the business, uh, as well as was very motivational with existing staff. So she dealt with underperformers. There wasn't really a performance culture. She decided what culture she wanted in the organization, got the board's, full support for that, which meant some uncomfortable changes of people who'd been in position for quite a while, but they supported her in making those changes. Some of them were risky because of their people's position in the market and so on. And bit by bit, over the course of the next, I'd say 2 to 3 years, the organization was absolutely transformed, has become very high performing. Interestingly, the next issue, the board has changed since, there's a chair retired. The CEO is probably not too far away from retirement now. And so the big issue is, is about leadership succession at the moment. But that was a very nice thing to. I was on the board, after the CEO was appointed as part of the new board, but it was a great thing to see. So a lot of the hard work was done before I arrived, but it was really good to see that. Almost a textbook kind of how do you turn something around if you have the time to do it. You don't always get the time.
Patrick, it's such a pleasure to see about the way you describe this, because all the time we say that when you go to the internet, when you go to social media, when you go to LinkedIn and many places, or even when you network, there is so much information everywhere. We're overwhelmed with the information, but transformation is rare. And to hear about transformation story is so it's such a great lesson for everyone. I like the way you stress on the quality of leadership. Our leadership can actually drive productivity. Our leadership can transform a business, and in particular, because I'm a CFO by trade, of course, how the right CFO can really help. How the passion for the wealth creation process can be married with the discipline, and so passion and discipline together can help you really win much more than just a game. I always say passion just
Yeah,
will win one game.
it's interesting. I mean, at ESSA, our values are they actually reflect the name. So they're evidence-based, solutions-focused, strengthening trust, and always learning. And I think if a board has, it's making decisions which are evidence-based, you don't always have the evidence you need, but they're evidence-based. Um, if you are solutions focused, so you're not just focused on what's gone wrong, you're focused on actually, so how can we change that? How can we make that better? How can we take advantage of, a challenge as opposed to be consumed and negative about the challenge? Trust is much underrated as without trust, it's very hard to get things done. I've just written a LinkedIn article all about trust, and it's massively important for me that a good chair will try and engender a culture of trust amongst the board and trust between the board and the and the executive and with with key stakeholders. Um, I think that always learning for me is really, really important. Never think you know everything there is to know about something. There's always new insights, new information. Things are changing. You need to keep current. You need to keep on it. You need to be actively open-minded about things. And so I think those are really important ingredients of transforming organizations.
Now, thank you about mentioning about learning. Now, learning, continuous iteration. Yeah, that's what we experience in order to be better and better. So, thank you
Yeah.
so much for stressing on those things. That they're really, really fundamental. No, we never stop learning because each business situation is unique. There's never going to be a perfect situation or an imperfect situation.
Yeah.
Um, as a last thing, I wanted to ask you this when it comes to body effectiveness. Now,
Mm.
when things they start to look wrong, yeah. So, what warning sign should executives and investors look for? So, what is the early warning that people should detect when a board is heading towards dysfunction of failure, outright failure, in your view?
Yeah, so in the board book, I make a point early on of saying actually how important self-awareness is. So a board that isn't self-aware, both at an individual and a collective level, that's a sign. Because if they're not really aware of their strengths, their capabilities, the context that they're in, then they will probably make the wrong decisions. So the level of self-awareness, I think, is really important. I think arrogance is. I did another LinkedIn article on this. It was called "Arrogance is the Judgment Slayer." Um, Arrogance really undermines judgment. It can be hard when you've had a period of success not to have those growing feelings of overconfidence. But you really are very vulnerable, I think, when you've had a period of success, and you really need to look out for, the rocks that you might not see because you're looking beyond. So I think self-awareness, I think arrogance, I think a lack of trust. I know as an investor, if I was sitting with the management team I'd always look at the CFO's face when the CEO was talking. And if the CEO was, bigging things up a bit too much, usually it would be all over the CFO's face. They weren't quite going, "Ah," but you could see the discomfort. I've said this many times, so for those of you that heard this before, I apologize. But my grand told me something very important when I was a small boy, which was that it's really important to listen to what people say, but it's even more important to listen to what they think. And if you can, imagine what's in the thought bubbles when people are speaking. So if you're an executive, an investor, and you're looking at, you're hearing a board member speak, take a moment to think, well, I wonder what they actually think. Do they really think what they're saying? And if there's a big gap between those two things, then worry. Um, if they're brushing off something that's significant, worry. If they're not actually taking account of good fortune as opposed to good judgment, worry. If they take credit for things which actually were nothing to do with them, but were just, fortunate outcome, worry. That's a warning sign for me.
Thank you so much. And the interaction between the board directors, as you said, it really helps us to read really what's going on. And again, it's not something that is written on any books. It's something that you experience live when you're in the room. It's about reading the room, and obviously that's a priceless lesson you're giving us about this.
I mean,
Thank you. Sorry, go ahead, yeah, Patrick.
I was going to say finally, if you're saying what three characteristics do you think really good board members need to have? I'd say great judgment, superb interpersonal skills, and fantastic antennae. And it's that antennae that informs the judgment. Um,
Okay, welcome to this second part of this podcast with Patrick Dunne. And we're now going to be talking about director duties and liabilities. Patrick, I wanted to ask you a question. I know that there are lots of conversation about the legal duties. There are lots of conversation about how much education does one need to have in order to be a board director. Uh, so in your view, what is the biggest misconception that the directors have about the legal duties, but also, people in general? Tell me your views.
yeah, well, I mean, I guess there's the sort of general duties and liabilities which apply to all directors, and those are really governed by the law. Um, there are the duties and liabilities which are sort of expected of you. If you're in a listed company, for example, there will be codes of corporate governance which, they're there for investors, which it is assumed that you will, behave in a certain way, do certain things. And so in most countries, the stock exchanges have those fairly public. And then there are the very specific ones relating to your particular company or organization. And these, often people don't look at the articles of association before they take on a board role. And there may be things in the articles, which some may be historic, some may be more recent, which are very specific to that company, that organization. And often people aren't aware of those things. Excuse me. I think for people taking their first appointment, it's a very good idea to go on one of the courses that are available in most countries. Usually, a company's legal advisors will be able to arrange something as well, a legal briefing before you take the appointment. And they would hopefully summarize, the law in the country, the law pertaining to that type of organization, if it's a public company, as I said before. And also, here's a summary of things in the articles of association of the company which might be different. And then clearly in the area where I spent a lot of my experience in private equity or venture or growth capital area, there will be investment agreements. There will also be banking agreements, and these are contracts. So therefore, you have a you have a duty to be aware of what they are, and also to understand, what the key obligations are for the company in meeting those. Key in those will be if it's a buyout, for example, would be the covenants that the banks will expect you to adhere to. So they may be, financial, or they may be in terms of other things such as remuneration or the purchase of assets or the sale of assets or various other things. So I think there's quite a lot to be aware of, but I would put it in those three buckets of the general, the codes, and then the specific things relating to that particular company.
Thank you, Patrick. In actual fact, we see a flourishing of sites where we find, for example, advertisement about non-executive director position or non-executive director network. And most of the time, we tend to see there's probably a bit of confusion between general advisory and non-executive directorship. Now, I personally have done my Financial Times board director program, and some other people have done this, but as you rightly mentioned, Patrick, it's about really a strong knowledge eventually about the laws, because, as a director, when you become officially director, you have to have, certain duties, yeah, that they go well beyond the normal advisory. And you mentioned about investment agreement. I've actually been part of a business in which I was not a director, I was a fractional CFO, but I remember I had to report every month with board pack about the investment agreement and how this was progressing against the agreement effectively. Yeah. So how the business was progressing against the agreement. So thank you very much for pointing those out. That leads me to the next question. So I wanted to ask you is so we know that there is individual accountability. Yeah. So directors are individually accountable. However, the board is like a team. Yeah. It's not just one person. So so yeah, each director, has a certain responsibility, has a certain accountability. But how do we balance the overall collective board responsibility with individual accountability?
Yes, and I think at the heart of this is something I didn't mention in the previous point because I wanted to make it here is I mean one of the first things is are any potential conflicts of interest. So one of the things which we are individually accountable for is declaring whether we have a conflict of interest or a potential conflict of interest. It's the board's role to determine how conflicts of interest are dealt with and managed. So it might be, if you're on the board of a number of companies, you might get approached by someone to say, we're thinking of selling, would you be interested? And dealing with that. There might be financial conflicts of interest as well. So, you may have a preference for one decision over another because that will be, in terms of your personal position, that will be better for you or not. So, how you manage all of those things. And the best way to do that really is in the appointment letter that you get when you are appointed to be a board member, which, I mean, I think that is one thing that you should again, if it's your first appointment, you may not be familiar with this, but you should ask for, a detailed appointment letter, not just a letter which says, we've approved your appointment to be on this board, but a letter which sets out what the role of the board is, what the role of the subcommittees are, what the role of the executive is, what your role will be, what the expectations on you are, as well as all the other detail about remuneration and time commitment and insurance, directors' insurance and all of those sorts of things. In terms of a good way of thinking about the balance between the collective responsibility and the individual one is to think about the approval of the accounts. It might sound a very boring thing, but if you are not a financially sophisticated person, might be a very good manager. You have obviously some familiarity with numbers. You've managed budgets. You've done all that kind of thing, but you're not sophisticated in accounting sense. Then you'll have an audit and risk committee typically, or an audit committee at least, and they will do the main work in terms of scrutinizing the accounts, the financial control systems, the financial dynamics of the organization, and so on. And they will usually make a recommendation to the board to approve the accounts. Now, at one end of the spectrum, you could say, oh, well, I don't need to do anything because I'm not a financially sophisticated person by the definition of regulators and so on. And I trust Matteo. He's a fantastic accountant. He can be responsible for that. That would be at one end of the spectrum. That's a very dangerous position to take. Much better to take the position and understand that your real responsibility and legal duty in most jurisdictions is you are signing these accounts, you are approving these accounts, as a board. You need to understand these accounts. You can't in a court later on say, "Oh, I didn't know. I'm not an accountant. How would I know? I'm a creative guy or I'm whatever it might be." Um, it's your duty and you will be held accountable to make sure that you understand the accounts. And so where I'm chair, for example, I generally twice a year typically would get the finance director to talk through the whole board, the financial dynamics of the organization and how they're changing. When you get to the approving the accounts, usually we would get the auditor in to talk to the board um, only, without the executive who are not on the board, and talk us through the accounts, what things we should be aware of, those kind of things. So you have that individual accountability as well as the collective one, and you can't abdicate your individual accountability because you think someone else in the collection is the expert. Most courts, I think, from what I've heard, are generally reasonable though, so they wouldn't expect, the level of understanding to be that of, someone who spent 20 years in auditing as someone who hasn't. But they would expect you to make the effort and they would expect you to try and understand and take, put the work in to do that.
Thank you, Patrick. You mentioned about conflict of interest, and yeah, especially for those who start the career as a non-executive director, as a portfolio director. Yeah, this is something that probably requires a bit of deeper sort of conversation, because most of the time we see people that would like to start to have a portfolio career, but conflict is something that they never had previously before they started the portfolio career. So something really, really important to as a consideration. And the other one is really, we often hear about, okay, what is the director duties, and one of the duties that is obvious that it doesn't get mentioned in my view as much as it should be, is the fact that the director has to really act for the best interest of the company. So yeah, sometimes even though in a career you wanted to stuck to one particular sector, it's actually a bit more difficult to stick to one sector when you're a portfolio director, because then there is more risk
More
of
likelihood. Yeah.
uh,
Yeah. Yeah,
getting
that's that,
conflict of
that's true.
interest.
Yeah. But I think if you have a good conflicts of interest policy, and if you adhere to that, and if you have high integrity, and a good level of trust, but also scrutiny, then it's not too difficult in practice. Um,
Yeah, you can stay in more than one company in the same sector. Obviously, it's important to be
yeah.
aware of the nuances. Yeah.
Yeah.
So legal protection. What is your advice? Especially non-executive directors, those who are not really in the business every day, but they are part of the board, about legal protection, while obviously still, ensuring that the function is performed as in as a positive manner as possible, with as much impact as possible.
I mean, for me, I think. And it doesn't matter what size the company is. I think ensuring that there is someone fulfilling the company secretarial role who is highly competent is really critical to this. So if you're a public company, that's generally an employee of the company who's going to be often head of legal and also company secretary. That's a common kind of situation. If it's a small company, a startup, where you don't have the resources to fund and you don't really have enough for them to do either, then you can buy in that service, you can outsource that service, but ensuring that you have someone who is ensuring that you have good company records, that you're complying with the laws and the regulations. Most sectors have, a fair degree of regulation around them. Some sectors, financial service, healthcare, food, chemical, other sectors if something went wrong, it endangers people's lives, then they have fairly heavy regulation, and so it's ensuring that someone knows that, so that the chair and the directors, are constantly kept up to date with their obligations. So, where I'm chair, the company secretaries will usually be, sending an email to directors saying, just let you know, there's a new piece of regulation coming out. This is how it would affect us. This is how it would affect you as a director. This is what we need to do to prepare ourselves for that, or, we need to change this policy or that policy, and so on. I think the board apps now, so Diligent, Board Intelligence, these apps that are designed for board directors, you get an information flow through them as well, which is quite helpful too. So there's a knowledge thing. I think there's a skills thing that, so if there are conflicts of interest, then how do you navigate those? How do you do that in a good and skillful way? And at their heart are the basics of conflict management, which is a whole separate subject. But I think if people are good at managing conflicting objectives, conflicting, goals, personalities, all of those things, then that's, I think investing in yourself to learn how to be good at managing conflict is probably a good thing. And at its heart, I think is the culture of the board, and also the culture of the organization, and ensuring that you have a culture which is one of accountability, of responsibility, of care. Those things actually really will help a great deal, because we can't always get everything right. But I think if we're trying to get things right, if we're putting the effort in, then, if we do, um, if something does go wrong, and people are more likely to be understanding than if you have, disregard for things. I think the interesting thing also is to really understand your stakeholders. What have you signed up for with those different stakeholders, no matter who they are, whether they're shareholders, staff, and so on. So do you really, excuse me, understand what you've signed up for with that? So I think it's a complex area, but I think the principles are really straightforward in terms of making sure you've got the knowledge, making sure you've got the right resources within the organization to fulfill those things and to support you and to alert you, and making sure you've got the right behaviors. And that's largely down to the culture, again, as I said earlier.
Thank you for such a comprehensive view about this. And I would add that given my experience as well, sometimes a further study the specific risk of a specific sector. I'll give an example. I used to work in the wastewater sector, and I used to sit on three boards simultaneously. And now remember how health and safety, for example, was such a bigger
Mm,
point to be mentioned to be respected every month on the board meeting. Yeah, so each sector has its own complications. So if you're a non-executive director and you're not in the business every day, but there are things that are really particularly important that happens every day that could affect your liability, your responsibility. Yeah, get on top of those as much as possible. I don't know about your view, Patrick, on this. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, the very first company I worked for was a company called Air Products and Chemicals, and it was in the industrial gas business. And I remember my first day. I was just a graduate, and the sort of one of the motto of the company was safety first. And I was in a mathematical modeling job, modeling energy, modeling
Mhm.
distribution systems, and so on. So not handling, the industrial gases. But that very first day was devoted to, you really need to understand,
Mhm.
uh, why safety is so important to this business. We transport hydrogen, we transport liquid oxygen, stuff like this. And it was everything from, how you walk down the stairs, how you park your car if you have a car, all of these things. And double checking and treble checking, and you know there was this fantastic culture of attention to detail, of thinking about the consequences, of system thinking. So the effect of you being sloppy here will mean that over here something else could go wrong, and I really valued that. It was, for some people would potentially find that excessive and obsessive, but actually it was great discipline, and they had an amazing record, particularly given the things that they were doing. They did the fuel for the space shuttle and stuff like this, and amazing record as a company. But it was that culture of safety first.
No, thank you. Let's come to the next part, which is about both structure and remuneration. And so I wanted to ask you a question. Now, regardless, well, especially when you are it's an early stage company, like a startup and a scale up, yeah. Um, the way in which companies should structure the board, yeah, in your view, because especially in those situations, we got founders who have to become effectively CEO, and then they need to start to delegate really the execution of the business to executive directors, and then executive directors that they come on board with the non-executive directors they will come on board with chairman and so on. So what skills and diversity matter the most when you really start to compose a board? Yeah.
Yeah, so in the startups I've been involved in, I think about, you have to think about what you are at this moment, and you have to think about what you want to be. And in terms of building a board, you need to be sort of slightly ahead, in terms of from what you are to what you want to be. So, if I think of ESSA, for example, which we started in 2016, so it's nearly 10 years old. So in the beginning, there was myself as the founder, and there was a friend who believed also in the thing that we were wanting to do, Chris, great guy, Chris Boy, and we ultimately wanted to have a board because ESSA is working on big systemic problems in African education. We ultimately wanted this organization to be an African organization. Chris was African, I'm not. And we thought actually in this first phase, what do we need the board to be? We need we need a board which is going to be good at setting up an organization, getting the organization established, getting the thing launched, getting the funding in, getting recruiting a good team, getting good processes so that the thing was very well governed, because in terms of raising funding and sustaining success, we wanted that. So initially, we had a very small board. We had three of us to start with. Then we recruited a CEO. We wanted to have a CFO, but we didn't quite have the funding at the beginning and or the scale to justify a full CFO. But that was our plan. So we planned for probably about 5 years hence. But it wasn't so much the years, it was the steps. So what do we need the board to be once we've raised capital, we're starting to do work. We had a clear idea about what sort of partners we wanted in terms of funding partners, other strategic partners, and we thought about, well, what would they want to see in the board that we have? So we were constantly thinking. Today, I'm the only non-African on the board. We have board members in Ghana, Kenya. We've had Uganda, Zambia, and soon we'll have Senegal. So we have a diverse group in terms of geography. We have a diverse group in terms of their experiences. We have a diverse group in terms of age. So we have a broad range of ages on the board as well. We now have a really strong senior leadership team, with a CFO, a CEO, a CFO, and a couple of others. There are four. Um, and we have subcommittees. At the beginning, we realized we would want to have subcommittees. So, we basically just set up two, an audit and risk committee and a nominations and remuneration committee. And that's been sufficient for the stage that we are at the moment. We have two legal entities. So we have a legal entity in the UK and one in Ghana. And so we need a board for the Ghana operations. And also, we want to make sure those two boards operate well together. Um, and so we have some common members of those two boards and so on. So we're constantly thinking about what is the next sort of step, what is the next scale. And if you're a startup in the venture space, of course, you might be thinking of an IPO or an exit. What's the board you need to get you to that thing? So I think it's really about building a board with the skills and diversity which are relevant for what you're trying to do. So for us, it's really important that we have a mix of people who understand the education space, who understand technology, who understand how to build an organization, who understand how different places in Africa work and how to work with very large foundation funders, for example. So we have achieved, I think, for our relative scale, really good diversity and a really good skill set.
Thank you, Patrick. The key message here, especially if you are an early stage business, is really to stay ahead of the curve, really, because
Yeah,
yeah, so really
yeah,
anticipating what the business needs, and but each business is unique, as you have really pointed out. So say, for example, if you are a business that needs funding quite intensively, then you have to think about investor relation. So you
yeah,
have to think about maybe earlier for a CFO, because that's what gives confidence to an investor effectively. So and there are situations where investment agreements, for example, might actually dictate the board. I remember I've been in a situation where the investment agreement dictated, in a way, the presence of certain competence in the business. So yeah, it's important to always anticipate this. Yeah, I would say.
yeah. And one thing that a lot of people will wrestle with, particularly if you're a founder, is should you have an independent chair?
Mm.
Um, I I like that, and maybe planning for that. That helps to deal with founder syndrome. It helps to deal with all sorts of things. But you've got to make the right choice in doing that.
Yeah, independent
Um,
chair is yeah, it was really good with the right balance, obviously, and yeah, I mean, the evolution starts initially with the founder
yeah,
really becoming a CEO. That's not an easy path for many. I have to say it's probably the most difficult one because you have to
yeah,
change completely who you are from startup to scale up in particular.
yeah,
And then we got the executive versus non-executive director remuneration.
yeah.
Particularly, when we're talking about purpose-driven or non-profits board, tell me about your perspective, Patrick, from your experience.
Well, in many countries, the non-executives are called trustees in not-for-profits, and you can't pay them. It's against the law or the regulation to pay them. So you have a group of people, often who put in a lot of time, a lot of effort, and actually hold the accountability and the responsibility, but they're not paid. And then you have the executives who, they're driven by the cause, they're driven by the purpose, but they're doing an executive job. They should be paid executive salary. I think in the UK there's been quite a lot of talk around, what are appropriate levels of pay for, you know, people in larger charities, particularly where they're running, you know, organizations which are often bigger, more complicated, more challenging than many commercial organizations. Uh, and, attracting people is important. It's always a question of balance. And, you generally want someone running your organization, if it's a not-for-profit or a purpose-led organization, who really, really gets the purpose and is driven by the purpose. They're not just doing a job for the money. Um, but on the other hand, you need to attract great talent, and you need to have them fulfilled and rewarded. The area which is very different is, there tend not to be long-term incentive plans of the same nature as in corporates. Bonuses, a large number of charities just don't pay bonuses to the executive. So the interesting thing is, if you're on a board and you're recruiting people and you're not going to pay them long-term incentive plan through long-term incentive plans or bonuses and things, then you need to ensure that you're delivering on those other things that they would need to motivate them. So, you are, you can't treat them like a hired hand in the same way that you might do if you're paying someone, very serious amount of money to deliver certain things. It's just a different relationship. Um, my feeling is that non-profit boards need to operate in, the same degree of highly professional, I think business-like in the sense of, being well organized and rigorous and those sorts of things, which not all businesses are as well, if we're straightforward about it. But you need to have that balance, I think. Having a remuneration committee is the way that most people deal with this, making sure that remuneration committee is well advised, so you understand what the benchmarks are for pay, for the structure of remuneration, and so on is really important. In the charity sector, I mean, most people would combine the nominations and remunerations committee because there isn't the same level of work to do on the remuneration committee as there generally is in the commercial sector. That can be different with very international purpose-led organizations. It can be very complicated when you're paying people, particularly if you're transferring people around different places. The logistics of the remuneration and all of that can be can be quite complicated. So having a remuneration committee is a good way of doing it.
I think you're right. Remuneration committee is in some situation actually quite fundamental, shall we say? Because I've seen
Mm.
some, but obviously we're talking about uh, advanced, obviously, business, in the not necessarily early stage, but quite mature,
Mm.
especially when there are political pressures, of all sorts, with various stakeholders, so. And
Mm.
I presume your experience, you had lots of experience of situations where, stakeholders well, demand certain things that have to come from
Yeah. Yeah.
establishing committee, I would say, yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things that I tend to hear a lot myself personally, but obviously in general, in several industries, is about how long does a, does an appointment last really? Now, the question I wanted to ask you, obviously with your experience again, so many years, really, so many decades. Um, what do you think about this? Is board refreshment not used enough? And what happens when, for example, the boards get stuck with position, with certain character or characteristic? What's your view on this?
My view is actually, and what I like is a sort of constant refreshment.
Hmm.
So, what I mean by that is not everyone changing all the time, but actually, if you have a policy of saying in a board, we probably expect non-executives to serve 2, 3 year terms. That's the sort of expectation. We review every year whether that person is delivering, whether they're getting fulfilled and so on. Um, but if you have that and you have an average sized board of, from 6 to 8, 9, that kind of number, then you're going to have someone every year. Uh, at least if you do that. And I like the idea of having someone who's served a full term and they can be more reflective and they add a lot, often add a lot in that last year. If you work that right. And I love the idea of having someone new who's asking, all those questions maybe we asked a few years ago, but actually the time is different. And just because we asked them a few years ago and we had answers in a certain way doesn't mean that that's the right answer today. So I think that benefit of someone who's new and benefit of someone who is going can be really powerful. Um, I think it's very dangerous to try and microwave boards. Um, and it's very hard work if you're a chair, if you have suddenly 4 or 5 new board members. I've experienced that. It's worked well, but it's a different situation than if you have this constant. So I am always well, there's 2 organizations I'm chair of at the moment, and I spend a decent amount of time thinking about with the chair of the nominations committee, what's the next thing we need? What's the next thing we want? So, in the case of ESSA, that was we're expanding our work in Francophone Africa. So we need to add additional, you know, knowledge, wisdom around and networks around the Francophone African world. So that's where we've been. Now we were thinking that 2 years ago. We started the process of thinking about when would be the right time to add that person, and it so happens it's very soon now, and we have what we think is a fantastic candidate for that. And the way that we did that was through everyone's antennae being up, probably for 2 years, in terms of well, let's think about what sort of person we want, where, and all the rest of it, and then using our networks and knowledge to sort of identify someone who would have the right blend. In public companies, the codes determine, that you have those rotations, and people lose their independent sort of status if they're too long. Um, I think for chairs, there's a debate, and some people feel that 6 years is too short, that it should be 9, and different companies have different forms of that. Um, One of the things that I was involved in many years ago was the Higgs Review, and the Higgs Review was a review of corporate governance of large listed UK companies. And one of the things at the time that we observed was there were uh, probably a large number of chairs who had served for a very long time. And institutions had, in some cases, suggested, refreshing a change of chair, but nothing was happening. And one of the things that was defined and created through the Higgs Review was the role of the senior independent director. So a person who institutions could go to say, look, we really feel there should be change of chair. We've discussed it with the chair, but nothing is happening here. But also, as well as that function, if you like, the chair role is very demanding, very time consuming, and the senior independent role would be like a deputy chair. Um, Very importantly, though, the Derek Higgs, the late great Sir Derek Higgs, um, made the point that it's probably a good idea if that senior independent director isn't a candidate to be the chair, because then they can have that sort of more independent. If they're the person who wants to be chair and they're talking to the chair about moving moving on, that's probably not a good thing. So and that role of the senior independent director, that's now 23 years, I think, since then. But that role has stuck. I mean, most companies have senior independent directors who are public companies, and a lot of smaller organizations have the same role. They may call them different things. In the social sector in the UK, they might be the senior trustee or the vice chair or the deputy chair, that kind of thing. So I think that's a helpful mechanism when you have someone who wants to stay on too long. But term limits are really important, and they should be stated in appointment letters.
Thank you, Patrick. And this actually, when we see businesses, again, each situation is unique, but
Mm.
we need to balance sometimes, what we see as a necessity with however, other situation, like for example, where some chairman could become such an important point of reference for stakeholders that imagining the company without them sometimes could be quite a shock. It could be potentially also damage to the image of the business. So that,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah.
did it happen to you sometimes? Yeah.
Well, I think the interesting thing is, you don't have to do add those valuable things to an organization
Mhm.
always through the chair role. So some people might have them as a patron or, an ambassador or something like that, where they're still connected with the organization, but they're not running the governance. That's the distinction I would have. So, for example, I helped EY found the EY Foundation in the UK in 2014. It's been very successful. I was chair for the first 10 years, um, and I retired. And they were keen to keep the connectivity and some of the relationships. So they asked if I would be a patron, and I was, very pleased to do that. But I was really clear, and EY were really clear as well that that shouldn't be any involvement in the governance. Um, so I stepped down as chair. I became a patron. I speak at some things. I help to raise money. I, have some relationships with some of the key stakeholders, but I don't get involved in, I don't attend board meetings. Um, I don't serve on any of the committees, that kind of thing. But I love it. I love the organization. I love what it does. It helps, young people in poverty to have a better route to education and work, better path to employment. I really feel very strongly about that as a cause. And so I will, if they ask me to speak somewhere, if they ask me to do something, I will generally do it. But if they asked me to serve on a board committee, I wouldn't.
Okay.
And they
I
never
think
have.
thank you for giving your very special perspective, your experience as well, because obviously, yeah, when you live through these things, you're able to explain them a lot better as well. Yeah. Okay.
Hopefully.
Okay. So now let's come to the next phase. And finally, we come to part five, where we're going to treat a few subjects. We're going to treat the subject about audit, financial reporting, and also risk and oversight. Yeah. So the first question I wanted to ask you, Patrick, we've heard so much about audit committee uh, that are under pressure now more than they have been. Now, the question is, how can they be really effective? How can they really play the role really well and not just being reactive in your view?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would go back to that triangle of purpose, people, and process. I think in terms of effective and efficient, um, I think, you have to be really clear what the focus of the audit committee is, or if it's an audit and risk committee, the audit and risk committee, and we'll come back to that in a minute. And the basic thing is to ensure. I think this is where the chair of the audit or audit and risk committee and the chair of the nominations committee have a coordinating role. You have to make sure you have the right CFO and you have the right focus within the finance function, an internal audit function if you're big enough to have one yourself, or an external audit function. You have the right auditors, and you have the right, if you're a quoted business, you have the right financial advisors so that you are, not just giving the market the information that they need to make informed assessments of the company and to invest in it, but also that's a smooth process, and it balances the needs of different stakeholders. So I think if you take over the role as chair of an audit committee, then you really need in your first meeting to be absolutely clear with the rest of the audit committee and the board as a whole what the role of the audit committee is. Also, there is a lot to do. There are a lot of pressures, changes in regulation, changes in accounting practice, the business environment, the whole way that businesses plan and report. The technology has improved a lot. The pressure to have real-time reporting, where feasible in many businesses is quite significant. The rise of dynamic budgeting, things like that really are important for audit committees to get their head around. So there's a lot to potentially think about. So it's what's the right focus. And also, if you're on an audit committee, you don't want to think about just this year's accounts, just assuring that this year's the financial control systems are effective and risk is managed properly and so on. You kind of have to have a view of the strategy, where the business is going, and actually, are we set up to cope with that growth in terms of the financial management, financial reporting? So I think the purpose bit is really important. Clearly, having the right composition, the right people on the audit committee is really important. And if we look at, should you have an audit committee and a risk committee, or should you combine the two? One of the challenges at the moment is, I think, most audit committees are populated by, understandably, financially oriented people, whereas most of the big risks are non-financial. Everything ends up in a financial risk, but most of the big risks, are the non-financial things. And do you have the right people, in the audit and risk committee to balance that focus on the audit side, the assurance side, and the risk side, which is, one is more looking at today, looking backwards, the review point and making sure the financial systems are right for the future, and the other is more forward looking in terms of risk. So I think there's that. And then, are you efficient? are you effective in that sense? So have you got the right processes? Have you got the right relationship with the different people that you need to have so that you can help make them more efficient too? Lots of people chew up a lot of time through the audit process, in arguing with the auditors. Actually, a good CFO will anticipate the issues where there may be differences of view, where there may be challenge, and you will have thought through those before you encounter the issue rather than later. So I think there's a lot in that. It's a simple question. There is a lot of pressure, but I think through clarity of purpose, aligning everyone behind what that purpose is, through getting the right people on the audit committee, the right advisors, the right people in the executive team, and having, good process, I think you can actually remain effective and not just reactive.
Thank you, Patrick, for your view. What we tend to hear sometimes, however, is that uh, yeah, one of the key pitfalls that we are is excessive passivity in front of the auditors. And I just wonder if you've been in your career in a situation where maybe the board should actually themselves be more efficient in front of the auditors, and yeah, what the benefit would be, and what sort of, educational gap do you think exists still?
So I think there is a point where the non-audit committee or audit and risk committee members sort of delegate to the audit committee and audit risk. They don't just delegate the work, which is, what you need to do. They seem to delegate the responsibility and the accountability, and they can't because, if we're on the board or if we're a director, we all have, joint and several liability in most jurisdictions. And so, you know, just because we have experts in the audit risk, it doesn't mean that we don't have to know. So one way to overcome this is through a regular, maybe twice a year, get the CFO to explain and the chair of the audit risk committee to explain how the financial dynamics of the organization are changing, what issues are likely to be coming up, what are other people doing, and this has been particularly visible in my world where I'm advising boards and I chair a couple, is seeing how people have thought about dynamic budgeting. Are people being progressive? Are they being sort of well behind the curve, or are they actually, going step by step through this process to keep the risks of doing that sensible, but to take the advantages of it? So I think if you've got a new board member who, their strengths are other than on the financial side, then you need to invest in getting them up to speed, not just in terms of understanding, the basics, which most people will have, but also the specifics in terms of the dynamics of that particular business or sector or type of organization. People going into private equity backed situations for the first time are often, surprised by, it's just a very different nature of things that the PE firms might be interested in, and the depth that they expect the directors of their portfolio companies to understand on the financial side. So there's a whole lot of things in there. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for highlighting also about the role of the CFO. Obviously, a role I know very well because I'm a CFO by trade. So effectively giving confidence to both parties, stakeholders, and also the other board members. That leads me nicely to the next question. I wanted to ask you, what is the role that the board should play, just making sure that, okay, it's about compliance, of course, has to be done. But what about meaningfulness for the various stakeholders in the business?
Yeah, so for probably about 10 years, when I was on the operating committee through our group, one of my responsibilities was investor relations, which included, you know, all the presentations to investors, the annual report, those sort of disclosure type moments. And I remember when I started, I mean, my background was as being an investor, so I probably had empathy with investors. And the approach was basically to say, what information is it helpful for people to have, not just to understand and want to buy the stock, so not just from a sales point of view, if you like, but also so they actually understood what the business was, what the dynamic of that business was going forward, what were the key drivers of growth, what were the key risk areas, what might be the areas where performance would be variable from time to time. If you're building a long-term business, you know, you've got to invest to build capabilities, to build market presence, to build product presence, all the rest of it. So it wasn't just about reporting, the very bottom line. It was about understanding what's coming up. So if you're investing in, launching in new countries, in, a new business unit area, getting them to understand the ongoing business, the sort of repeat business, if you like, and those newer dynamics, and how they were likely to be effective. The other thing I think is that um, you sort of needs to be one step ahead of where the the code where investors are probably going. So I think the board needs to understand investors. So if you're a public company and you may be joining that board for the first time, I think sitting in on some one-to-ones with the investors is a really great thing because then you will understand, the sort of questions that they're asking of the CEO and the CFO or the chair. Now, most people who join big public companies have big public company experience at a board level or just beneath the board level. So they hopefully will have that. But that's not always the case. And it might be a different class of investors. So there's quite a big difference between, doing a US IR roadshow and, one in other parts of the world. There's quite a big difference between sitting down with hedge fund investors who have a shorter term, not all do, but a shorter term mindset to the long only investors who want to buy the stock and hold it, buy a substantial stake and hold it for a long time. So just as I said before, that it's important for the CFO to talk through with the board um, the financial dynamics of the business. I think you also need to talk through with them the investor dynamics of the business. So if it's a public company, again, how is the composition, the demographic, if you like, of the shareholder register? How is that changing? And what do we want it to be? So, you can't always choose your parents, people say. And if you're a public company, you can't always choose your investors. But actually, in your communication, you can attract certain types of investors. Should you want to build up that proportion of the register. So I think the board needs to understand, what the composition of the shareholder register is now, what it wants it to be, how, what's the plan for moving from one to the other if they're different. That classic sort of stuff.
Thank you so much, Patrick. And yeah, I mean the key question here is really, is there enough education for aspiring board members about what such a hub the board is for the various stakeholder? Because obviously I've been speaking about investors, but there are so many other stakeholder in the business, like employees and etc. So yeah, I mean the key question is about education. I mean, in your view, in just a few words, do you think is there a lot of work to be done to ensure that more education is circulated about this?
Yeah, I think so, because I mean, historically, the education for non-execs, if you like, was largely on the duties, responsibilities, you know, those sorts of things. If you look at classic education, you're looking at knowledge, you're looking at skills, you're looking at behaviors. And also because the stakeholder group will vary from organization to organization, you need to have an integrated stakeholder strategy so that you're making sure you're not forgetting about one stakeholder group. So, you might be really focused on your market, which is natural and understandable, but you might not be really understanding your investors, or you might not be really on top of the people issues. So you look recently, you've seen very high churn rates in many organizations. And to some extent, that's because the board has been perfectly happy with the company having a more and more transactional relationship with employees. And then it's surprised when employees, mirror that back and have a transactional relationship with the organization and don't see it and they say, well, why aren't they loyal to us? Well, you know, maybe it's because you've encouraged that culture, that climate. If you look at your suppliers, I think one issue a board needs to be really on top of is, what is the relationship with our supply chain? Do they see us as a really valued customer, or do they see us as someone who, batters them down on price, won't let them make any money, so they can't invest, and then moves on to the next one? Those relationships and the way that we approach those things really important. And you saw that coming through in COVID big time, where the companies which had really good integrated stakeholder strategies tended to have a lot more loyalty, a lot more commitment. People would do things for them that they didn't need to do, but they would do because they valued that relationship. So I think it's a really good question.
No, thank you very much. And as we always say in the Exponential Blueprint, we always encourage founders really to think about what makes it a high valuation strategies. And obviously, yeah, we've been speaking about positioning, but don't forget about structure. Structure is fundamental to really go from invisible to investable. And that leads me very nicely to next question is, how do you assess the quality of an organization financial literacy at the board level, which I know is a very, very important subject for many.
You can tell when you're on a board, you've just joined for the first time, or you're observing a board by the nature of the questions that people will ask, the openness of the finance CFO, the way the CEO and the CFO interact. So, does the CFO actually understand the business? Um, and then I think, in your individual conversations with people, when you get the board pack and you chat with another non-exec, what did you think of this? What do you think of that? If they don't seem to have really read and understood the financial sort of section of the board papers, then that's a concern. So you may need to suggest diplomatically that it might be worth you spending an hour or two with the CFO in the coming months just to understand why that issue is important, why that metric, that whatever it is, has changed, why the auditors are grumpy with us, why you need to understand. And there's nothing like, a high degree of humility. I think a trap that many fall into is they think people expect them to know, and they don't know, and they don't want to reveal ignorance. And no one likes to reveal ignorance in front of other people, really. So often this is about what you pick up in one-to-one conversations. And I think one of the roles I see is that for the chair of the Audit and Risk Committee is to ensure that their colleagues on the board do have a good level of financial literacy and support them in getting more. So, some audit chairs see it as their role to make sure that the board gets regular updates on things. All the major accounting firms, legal firms do, update sessions, and they're usually free, and you can go along and you can meet other people on other boards who probably got the same issues that you have. So I think it's that kind of thing that will really, once you've assessed the quality, is actually help you do something about it.
I thank you for touching on training and also the point you mentioned before about potentially not just in terms of literacy, but also in dissemination of financial information to the business. Yeah, as you mentioned before, it would be useful for the CFO to take the lead and potentially have session, let's say a regular session, which could be, once, as you said, once every quarter or twice a year. I think, that's a very, very valid point. Yeah. And I think, many CFO, should sometimes think about taking more leadership than they normally do. That's my encouragement to many of my peers, I would say.
Yeah. And I
Mm.
think it's a sign of a strong CEO if you've got a CEO who is encouraging of that rather than just tolerant of that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me ask you now this question about risk management. Yeah. Now,
Mm.
I always say, the business only exists because somebody took a risk. Yeah. Um, and after that initial risk, the business has to live with risk forever. So it's not as if risk can be avoided. Has to be calculated, has to be managed. So, in your view, why is risk management fundamental?
Well, businesses, as you've said already, very, very clearly, you take a risk, and the intention is that the return that you get for taking that risk is commensurate with it. Or, in your dreams, you're going to make a higher return than the risk might be because you manage more effectively. I think I wrote a LinkedIn article very recently, and I think it's time to change the way for many boards that we think about risk. I think combining audit and risk, which I was a big fan of, I think now I'm questioning whether that is the right approach and whether it is better to have a separate risk committee. I think for reasons I indicated before. So you get that focus and you get that broader composition of that committee. So you're thinking, you've got the better balance between the financial and non-financial risk areas. The next thing is, it's even more fundamental than it's ever been because of volatility, because of the world that we live in now is much more of a winner take all type market. The speed with which people gain market dominance is much faster than it used to be because the information is more readily available to consumers, to buyers, whether that's business to business or whether it's business to consumer. Um, the next thing is that I think if you look at a lot of risk registers, they're populated by events. You know, this will be a risk if this happens. This will be a risk if that happens. Whereas actually, for an organization, the thing which matters most is the consequences of those events. And so you see many risk registers which are populated by, you know, they're incredibly difficult to read. They're very small font sizes, lots of colors. I mean, it's just very difficult to get the clarity. Whereas if you think about in terms of managing risks, more about the consequences that might happen, you might have six events which might lead to a consequence that you might have. And you're better planning and mitigating for the consequence rather than the event. Most of these events that you put on your risk register, you can't influence the outcome on. The thing that you can most influence is how you respond to a consequence of an event. So let's just take, for example, COVID. So, um, I think I may have mentioned this before, but I was struck at EY by the fact that EY was thinking about one consequence it had in its research was what would happen if we can't go into our offices worldwide today, and that was for a prolonged period. What would we do? And they had that plan, and it worked brilliantly for COVID. So rather than having a specific COVID risk and mitigation. It was actually the thing which will hurt our business would be if we couldn't get into our offices. And so, what do we need to do to serve our clients, as effectively as we can and as quickly as we can if that happens? So there was a brilliant plan in place for that. And that was it. The next thing I think is to do with risk is to do with the differentiation between risk appetite and risk tolerance, and risk appetite and risk tolerance for different types of risk. So, for example, we might actually have a reasonable appetite for business risk, market risk, if we've got a very strong financial position. If we have a weak financial position, then we're less likely to be prepared, or we should be, to take massive business risk, because the consequences would, they may be more life-threatening, threatening to us. And I think often in the way that risk is presented, people talk about a risk appetite in aggregate, and I think that's a mistake. I think we should talk about our risk appetite by, the big categories. Um, and our tolerance is to do with, the degree to which we are in a robust position, not just financially, but, do we have the capabilities? So in an era where many middle management teams have been hollowed out, where we have been focused on lean and these sort of things, do we actually have the capacity and the capability? And that might be directly through our own teams and employees, or it might be through the advisors that we use, the group of people who can support us if something happened. So I think there's a hell of a lot to do in this risk area. And one of the areas, which is what we've been talking about, is, do we have the information flows, and can we get information quickly enough so that if this risk materializes, we can respond in the most effective way? If we have to make a decision within a week, but we're not going to get the financial information that would help us make that decision the most effective way for 3 weeks, obviously that presents an even greater risk. And then the other final thing I'd say is that often we focus just on one risk at a time. And what we found in the last few years, I think, is there's a it's quite frequent that there's a combination of consequences driven by events that cause the problem. And so, is our mitigation for this, for that, for another thing, is that solid if two or three of them happen at the same time? So have we thought through, the combinatorial risk, if you like, for that? So I think it's a massive topic. It's really fundamental to business. It's changing, and I think we need to respond and anticipate that. And probably, I think a great topic on a board agenda, particularly as we run up into the end of the calendar year, would be: are we thinking about risk in the right way? Have we got the right approach to risk?
Yesterday, I actually published a weekly edition of the newsletter, edition 32, and it was about risk management. And I mentioned a staggering list of statistic that really supports a lot more thinking about risk. For example, one statistic was that 43% of businesses that are hit by an uninsured loss, they never reopen.
Yeah.
Another statistic was from IBM. IBM estimated that the average loss from a cybersecurity event is $4,450,000. Uh, so this is where really, education is never really enough, shall we say? Also because each business is unique. So you can never say, okay, that risk management approach is okay for that business and it's going to work for the other business as well. Which is why a board director should be 100% immersed into the business. And the other point I was making yesterday was about the insurance program. So making sure that you got an insurance program,
Yeah.
that you'd review it very frequently. What's your view on that, Patrick?
I agree, and most organizations absolutely do that. And it's not just, I mean, the interesting thing as well, if you're an investor, people will say, yeah, we have insurance. And, I always remember a very important piece of due diligence was making sure that the premiums were paid. because if the premium isn't paid, you have no insurance. Um, and it's one thing to say, yes, we have a policy for this, but actually, what is the level of cover that you have? What are the exclusions? Understanding that. Yeah, but that again is something, the Audit and Risk Committee should be on top of. Have we got the right level of cover? Insurance is clearly expensive for things, so in cyber, for example, if you look at a lot of the cyber policies, they have exclusions around, well, if the board hasn't done its job in terms of educating itself about cyber risk, if you don't have the processes in place that are, the following, then there is no insurance. So many people say, oh, yes, we have cyber insurance, but well, what is that insurance and what's it cover for? And what are those exclusions? And what do we need to do as a board to make sure we're fulfilling our obligations under that policy so that we don't risk it being, an invalid claim if we had to make one.
And the key goal is always to make any failure as small as possible so that it becomes a lesson and is
Yeah.
not going to be a total loss. Thank you
Yeah.
so much for running me through. Do you want to add something else, Patrick?
No, no, I was just going to sum really by saying there is a lot to do here, and realistically, you know, the pressure is high, and so that's why focus, making sure we've got the right advisors, making sure we've got the right team is so important, and that then makes the board's job much easier, and they're much better able to focus on the key and the most important things. If they're filling in gaps because of a weak CFO, or then it becomes very difficult.
Thank you for reaffirming this, and it's really, really important. Okay, before we move to the closing of this podcast, I wanted to ask Patrick, probably some of the most important question, which is about his activity, his current activity, his past activity, and the highly precious educational books that he has written. I just made an example of one book that Patrick has written. It's about board education, and please feel free to tell us more about this book. Patrick.
Yeah, so I wrote boards. I'd written a couple of other books before, but I helped the Financial Times design their board director programs and do various sessions on that over the years. And they thought it would be really useful to have a summary type book. So rather than pick a board topic, that just from a very practical point of view will be a companion for board directors as they go through their board experience. So the book is basically, designed around purpose, people, and process, just diving deep on those three different areas. Half the book are case studies with real examples that you navigate through the story of the situation. The latest edition was updated towards the end of COVID, so it's not that old. And There's a big focus on the behavioral dynamics, big focus on decision making, for example, and it looks at boards across the world, and also very many different types of organizations. So from startups, growth companies, public companies, social sector, as well as commercial. Yeah, I hope it's helpful. Um, Another book which is more recent is the Five Generations at Work, which came out in the last year. That's about the I think the lost opportunity that's there at the moment, where people are focused in terms of thinking about intergenerational working, about minor little problems in understanding and so on. Whereas there's a massive opportunity with five generations in the workforce to make the most of those different generations. And so that book is about how do you do that? And it looks at examples from, again, right across the world. There's about 6 years of research involved in that, where we looked at what are companies doing, what are organizations doing that aren't commercial as well, to make the most of those different generations. So next gen boards, lots of things in that's really really practical. So yeah, and then the LinkedIn articles, I suppose, are probably the biggest way that people will get in touch. So once a quarter, I produce a LinkedIn article on a topic of relevance to boards. So the latest one is around trust. The one before that was around risk. They've been on dynamic budgeting. They've been on um, managing conflict, all sorts of things. So they're the ways that people generally get in touch. And LinkedIn is probably the easiest way these days. So, if you put my name in and boards, you should I should come up.
Now, takes me back to my education with the Financial Times Board Director Program, where board effectiveness dominated the course. And the fact that you got so many case studies in your book really makes it so fun to read and to learn about, because case studies really are what will teach the most. We can talk about theory all day, but eventually practice, learning from real cases is what you really need. So highly recommend this book. It's really a fantastic source. Because I see so many people, they want to become non-executive director, board directors, but they need the right education. So yeah, no, thank you so much. And obviously in the Exponential Blueprint, we will find a lot more from Patrick. About this, and obviously, it's very welcome to become an expert for the boardroom in general. The other thing I wanted to ask you is about the current activity about ESSA. Tell us more about this, Patrick.
Yeah, so I founded ESSA in 2016, and it was a result of spending quite a lot of time with another charity I founded and helped to build called Warwick in Africa, which was teaching kids and te training teachers in slums and in rural areas of poverty in Africa. And one of the things which struck me on the ground, I've been going to Africa for about 20 or more than 20 years now, um, was uh, the lack of evidence-based decision making in terms of making investments in education. So you'd often find a lot of money being wasted. I mean, a lot on ed tech in areas where there wasn't electricity, or you'd see that kind of thing, and yet you'd see fantastic examples, usually locally created and driven, which couldn't get any money, and it seemed this mismatch between where the money was going and where would have effect. Now, if you look at the demographics of Africa, and actually that's in the Five Generations at Work book, I think on page 27, you'll see that as opposed to all the other continents, the African demographic is very different. So you have another billion people expected in Africa very soon now. 1 in 4 of the world's population will be African. And that's a massive challenge in terms of, you know, economically, there's an enormous opportunity that brings, but only if you have the right education environment. Um, and so what I was seeing was, there's a capacity issue, massive capacity issue. Most African universities only have half the faculty they currently need. And if you say how many of those faculty can teach in a blended learning way, you're making the most of technology, that number would fall even further. Yet you've got another billion people arriving. So what are you going to do? So I formed ESSA with some friends and some great support initially from the Robert Bosch Foundation, but now we have a broad range of funders to basically be an organization which gathers evidence where it exists, puts that evidence in front of the people who are making decisions around policy, around investment, and therefore that will improve the efficiency of investment in education in Africa. we have had a wonderful nearly 10 years now. We've made great progress in a number of areas. So, in African-led education research, so giving Africans more power, if you like, in terms of doing research on education. So it's not all education that's been done in the North or the West, it's African-led. Uh, Putting that in a free online database so everyone can see what evidence is already there, which also enables you to see where the gaps are, and then helping to fuel support for where those gaps are. So currently, we've just made 31 grants to African researchers in a range of different countries on a range of different topics because there isn't any research on that topic. And so we can get better information for that. I'm the only non-African on the board. We have an all-African leadership team. It's a virtual organization. And so we have people across a whole range of different African countries who are doing the work. Sometimes that work is, you know, country specific for their particular country where they happen to be. Sometimes it's for a range of countries, so it might be for six or 10 countries. So, but we could always do with more support because we have, a big list of things that we would love to do that need doing, that we would like to do. So, if anyone is interested in African education and interested in systemic change, then take a look at the website and get in touch. We'd love to hear from you.
Well, one hand has been raised is from the exponential blueprint because we could not be in more agreement than what you have said about education in sub-Saharan Africa. Um, Now, I just mentioned two things. First of all, a big statistic from Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs has made some projection a couple of years ago about the economy in 2050 and 2075. Nigeria is on course to become economy number 9 in one generation and economy number 5 in the world in two generations, 2075. Now, that's an amazing situation because you can imagine Nigeria will have a bigger economy than any other economy in Europe. I know for many that will be surprising, but that's what Goldman Sachs are anticipating. The other big country that Goldman Sachs has anticipated is going to be much, much higher in the range will be Ethiopia. And by the way, Ethiopia early this year, they opened a stock exchange, which is it's going to be quite interesting to see how that will develop in future. And let's not forget, what we stand here for at the Exponential Blueprint is to help potential entrepreneur to go from invisible to investable. There is a lot of education about wealth management in the world, but what about wealth creation? So that's what we want to help. We want to help entrepreneurs, especially in Africa, especially in countries where there is a desire to learn. So, definitely we would like to really sort of, extend help to you, Patrick, on this mission. It's a very important mission for everyone.
Thank you.
And so let me just remind everyone about the Exponential Blueprint. You can reach us every Wednesday. The Exponential Blueprint is trusted already by more than 22,000 founders, investors, and executives. Currently, my activity is more M&A. I'm actually managing a book of $480 million to make acquisition into businesses in the new economy, clean economy, renewable energy, and commodity production. And don't forget to join our YouTube channel. Currently, there are more than 40,000 subscribers. I'm very excited to always, be able to give you a reply to your comments. Do not hesitate to write more about also this topic with what we discussed with Patrick here. The link is to your right, and underneath this video, on just below, you will find the link about how to make the next move. Let me thank very much Patrick for this. And by the way, while we're doing this podcast, Patrick has become grandfather for the second time. Correct me if I'm wrong, Patrick.
Thank you.
Okay.
Got a little girl. Yeah.
So little girl. So very much congratulations. And we'll be happy to see you on the next episode of the Exponential Blueprint for our podcast. Thank you for your attention today.